Okay. Tom says that critics of recent high court decisions claim that judges' willingness to abide by earlier decisions is necessary to avoid legal chaos. Since high courts of the past often repudiated legal precedents and no harm to the legal system ensued, these critics' objections must be politically motivated and ought to be ignored. And then Mary says high
Wait,
courts have
stop with Tom. What is Tom's conclusion there? Or what is Tom arguing for?
I wrote that Tom says that these critics' objections must be politically motivated and ought to be ignored.
And then and then note, whenever we have two people like talking like this, we can always assume that Mary is responding to Tom. I think that, I mean, it kind of sounds like common sense, but
Yeah.
it's not like we just put two people and then like put their comments together. Mary heard what Tom said and is responding. This is more relevant when it comes to like agree and disagree questions.
Yeah.
This, I never really knew that. Like we can always assume that they know like what's going on.
Gotcha.
All right, so then how does Mary respond to Tom?
Mary says that high courts have repudiated precedents in the past, but they were careful to do so only when the previous rulings were old and had clearly become outdated. The recently overturned rulings were themselves recent. Overturning any recent legal ruling diminishes the law, which comes to be viewed as unstable and capricious.
Okay, so what is Mary's conclusion?
I think I said overturning any recent legal rule diminishes the law, which comes to be viewed as unstable and capricious.
Yes. So Tom is kind of saying, hey, critics of the, okay, I'm gonna, even though we just said it, like Tom is saying critics of recent high courts decisions claim that judges' willingness to abide by earlier decisions is necessary to avoid chaos. So he's saying like, hey, we have to listen to, or the recent court decisions are based on the judge willingness to listen to what people used to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he says that since high courts of the past often repudiated legal precedents and no harm to the legal system ensued, these critics' objections must be politically motivated and ought to be ignored. So he's saying like, hey, the judges listened to these old things to avoid chaos. However, these decisions were based on something that isn't legit, and so we should ignore them altogether.
Yeah.
Where Mary comes in and says high courts have repudiated precedents in the past, but they were careful to do so only when the previous rulings were old and had clearly become outdated. The recent overturned rulings were themselves recent. Overturning any recent legal ruling diminishes the law, which comes to be viewed as unstable and capricious. So she's kind of saying like we would have done like the overruling today is a recent thing, right? So the judges are not basing their decision on that, correct?
Yeah.
So what answer choices did you narrow this one down to?
I narrowed it between C, D, and E, and I got rid of A and B off the bat.
Claims about the effects of reversals by high courts of the past. She agrees to, okay, so let's just start with E then. She introduces a distinction between two kinds of situations in which precedents are overturned in order to argue for a difference that Tom fails to take into account. Okay, so what would be the two kinds of situations that she brings in?
So this is where I got stuck. This is why I wound up eliminating because I couldn't figure out the two kinds of situations. So I knew that she was talking about the careful to do so only when the previous rulings were old and had clearly become outdated. That's what I noticed. And I was like, okay, she's talking about repudiating precedents, but only when they're old and they're outdated. So I took that as like one situation.
Okay. Is there another situation that she talks about though?
I wasn't sure if the recently overturned rulings of themselves were themselves recent was also a situation.
Okay, well, she says she introduces a distinction between two kinds of situations in which precedents are overturned. So our first situation are when the high courts did it in the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the second one, yeah, is the recently overturned rulings themselves.
Yeah.
So she's telling us like, hey, this used to happen, and then we do it today and it's different.
Yeah.
And Tom fails to take this into account. Sorry, I didn't mean to pick the right answer to go over first.
No, it's okay, because that's good, because like I said, the reason I got it narrowed it down to 3 and then I eliminated E, I'm pretty sure like third was because I was like 2 kinds of situation, because I literally thought,
Are there 2 kinds? No, I think it's tricky, and this would not be automatic for me to select. If E was A, I would continue reading the answer choices for
yeah,
sure. So C, she defends a practice against Tom's criticisms by citing evidence to show that it has usually been resorted to only after due deliberation. Okay,
I
so
went with this one initially, but now looking
so
back at
what
it,
would be the practice? Yeah.
yeah, I now that I'm looking at it, I'm like, okay, a practice, I'm not really sure where that is, and then like to only after due deliberation, like, do we know that?
Right.
Like,
She doesn't like come straight at Tom.
yeah,
She's not like, you're all wrong. She just kind of
yeah.
brings like at all. Like she doesn't really criticize anything that he says directly.
Like, I think what she's doing is just like pointing out like additional information that like,
An alternative
again,
explanation, right?
that he's literally not taking into account before he makes his claim that's kind of like egregious.
Yes, yes. And so Dee says she points out that Tom's conclusion rests on an assumption that is contradicted by the evidence.
Yeah, no.
So yeah, does Tom contradict himself really at all? Or does she
No,
point
he's
out
like,
like
yeah.
she's not like all cows are green and she's like, actually there's a purple cow over there. Like,
Yeah, no, she doesn't do that.
awesome. Okay, so then A, she questions Tom's claim about the effects of reversals by high courts of the past. Does she question Tom's we don't question anything that he said.
Yeah.
And then B says she agrees to Tom's evaluations of certain critics' motives, but no, we don't agree.
He never says anything, oops, about the motives.
Right. And then introduces evidence to show that it's usually difficult to discern. Yeah. So honestly, I would have gotten to E by process of elimination because I know those ones are right. And then the 2 kinds, I wouldn't have loved like, oh, is this a second thing? But this at least can somewhat fit into what we need it to fit into for this
Yeah.
answer
Like,
versus
I
other
totally,
ones.
like, I get what you're saying of like just literally taking what's being said and plug that in to the answer choice and like see if it follows like,
Yeah, if we can't, do we have something to fit into each of these like
yeah.
points? Where at least E, we at least have a chance, right? With the 2 kinds.
Yeah.